Howdy everybody, Dr. Andy Woods here. I'm the pastor teacher here at Sugarland Bible Church. This is Pastor's Point of View number 316. Today is August the 23rd, 2024. As you can see, I'm flying solo again. A lot of people have asked, where's Pastor Jim? What happened to him? Unfortunately, he's had a few health issues that he has to look into. And he posts regularly on his personal Facebook page about what's going on in that area. So I would, to kind of catch up with him and what's happening with him in the area of health, I'm just going to go ahead and send you over to his personal Facebook page, Jim McGowan, and you can catch up with him there. But please keep him in your prayers. We hope and trust he'll be back with us in the not too distant future. In the meantime, you are stuck with me, so to speak. This is a prophecy update, and as you look on the screen there, you can see a preview of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. As you can see, that's a long list, 7 things. We'll probably finish the first 3 in this session, and then we'll have to reserve the remaining 4 for a subsequent session. But here we're going to look at the Gog-Magog alignment, the world against Israel, and I have some new information to report to you concerning the prospect of a third temple. All of these are prophetically significant. So let's go ahead and start with the Gog-Magog alignment. Of course, here what we're speaking of is Ezekiel 38 and 39, where Ezekiel 2,600 years ago saw a coalition of nations spearheaded by Russia from the north coming against Israel in the last days. And this invasion is not happening now, but you can clearly see how the table is being set for this coming invasion. So there's a lot to bring you up to speed on in that regard. As you can see on the screen there, I wrote a book called The Middle East Meltdown. And I bring that to your attention because we're going to be talking about Iran, Turkey, Russia, the Sudan, and Afghanistan. And you might be asking yourself, are those modern countries really predicted as invaders in Ezekiel 38 and 39? And if so, how do we know? Well, I provide the documentation for you in that book. It's too much information to sort of recycle in a prophecy update. So if you want more proof or validation on these points, I would send you to that book. But let's go ahead and start with our map here. Notice we've got Iran, who we believe is Persia, circled. And very clearly Ezekiel predicted that Persia or Iran would be one of the invaders of the land of Israel in the last days. Is the stage being set for that? Oh my goodness, you don't have to look far in today's world, do you? It's just a matter of opening your newspaper and seeing it. Notice this article here, August 15th, 2024, from the Jerusalem Post. The title of it is, according to the United States, Iran attack could come with no warning, possibly in the next few days. And here's what the article says. It says Iran could attack Israel with no warning within days. Boy, that sounds like something right out of Ezekiel 38 and 39, doesn't it? According to the White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby, who said Thursday as the region remained on edge. Quote, an attack could come with little or no warning and certainly could come in the coming days, and we have to be ready for it, he told reporters during a virtual meeting. The U.S. has beefed up its military presence in the region in advance of a possible Iranian attack and has stated repeatedly that it is prepared to defend Israel. Continuing on with the article, it says the U.S. hopes that the finalization of a Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal would prevent Iranian and Hezbollah reprisal attacks for twin assassinations 2 weeks ago. The first assassination, which Israel took credit for, was of a Hezbollah commander in Beirut. The second, which it has not claimed responsibility for, was of Hamas leader Haniya in Tehran. It is widely presumed that Israel killed Haniya. So right now, as we're recording this, we're living in this tension where Israel has taken out a Hezbollah leader, a Hamas leader, the latter of which they took out on Iranian soil. It's largely believed that Israel is responsible not just for assassination number one, but assassination number two. And here is Iran contemplating what it's going to do about it, contemplating an imminent attack on Israel. Now, all you have to do is go back to mid-April, and you remember that Iran launched about 300 projectiles from its own land into the land of Israel. So an attack is obviously something that she's done recently, and she's contemplating doing it again. And somehow Iran is attaching whether she's going to attack or not on Israel reaching a ceasefire with Hamas, related to what Hamas did to the Israelis coming from Gaza into the land of Israel and committing those terrible events in October 7th of last year. And Israel now has gone into Gaza and is basically trying to eradicate Hamas from Gaza, which is their right to do as a nation. And of course, Iran doesn't like that. And so now Iran is conditioning whether she's going to retaliate against Israel for at least the second assassination based on how the Israelis are going to treat Hamas in Gaza. So the whole region is on edge right now. And I can't think of a better stage setting for Ezekiel 38 and 39, which anticipates a Persian or Iranian invasion into the land of Israel in the last days. I mean, we're literally living in a time period where Ezekiel's prophecies are jumping right off the page, and the stage is being aggressively set for something that Ezekiel saw under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit 2,600 years ago. Now, with all of that being said, let's talk a little bit about Turkey. Here is our map where we have Turkey circled. We believe that Turkey is Meshach, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah, mentioned in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. And notice how the relationship between Israel and Turkey is souring. You know, Turkey is very interesting. Turkey used to be a place where Israelis would take their vacations. But Ezekiel said 2,600 years ago, watch Turkey very carefully because she will be one of the invaders along with Iran into the land of Israel. And so we're living in this time period where Turkey has flipped. And the whole scenario of Turkey invading Israel is extremely credible. Just a couple of articles for you on that, if we could. Notice this article from Times of Israel, August the 14th, 2024. It says, Turkey is trying to crank up global pressure on Israel, Erdogan tells Abbas. The article says, Turkish President Erdogan's office says he told visiting Palestinian President Abbas that Turkey will continue to support the Palestinian cause and push the international community to increase pressure on Israel. Erdogan condemned Israel's war in Gaza, the statement says, accusing some Western countries of remaining silent on what he termed massacres in Gaza, which the president deemed unacceptable, his office says. Erdogan also told Abbas that all countries, especially in the Muslim world should step up efforts to ensure an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the uninterrupted delivery of humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. So is it not interesting that the events of October the 7th have not slowed down Turkey's animosity towards Israel, but increased them? They have not slowed down Iran's animosity towards Israel, but have increased them. And both Iran and Turkey are basically saying, you know, you Israelis, you better not root out Hamas out of Gaza, or else we're going to turn up the pressure on you. Iran says we're just going to invade you. Turkey here, a place where Israelis used to take their vacations, is now saying we're going to gin up support in the rest of the world, the rest of the Muslim countries. We're even going to try to get some Western countries involved in animosity towards Israel. So once again, a scenario of Turkey coming against Israel in the last days, when you look at today's headlines, is an extremely credible scenario. Notice this other article here concerning Turkey. This one comes from AP News, August 7th. 2024, it says Turkey formally asked to join the genocide case against Israel at the United Nations Court. Now this has to do with a case, an international law case that has been filed against Israel on the grounds that the Israelis are committing genocide against the people in Gaza, when in reality they're not committing genocide against the people in Gaza. What they're doing is going into Gaza and trying to root out a terrorist group, Hamas, from Gaza. But the world community, of course, doesn't understand it that way. They look at what the Israelis are doing as somehow violating international law, so international humanitarian protocol, etc. So what has happened is now the nations of the earth, through the globalist court, the International Criminal Court, heavily connected to the United Nations, has actually filed a lawsuit arguing the Israelis are committing genocide. And nation after nation after nation around the world has now joined into that lawsuit. And now, lo and behold, here is Turkey joining into that lawsuit, which does nothing more but increase the animosity between Turkey and Israel. Exactly what Ezekiel said would happen on the eve of the Gog-Magog invasion. At any rate, here's what the article says. Turkey on Wednesday filed a request with the UN court to join South Africa's lawsuit accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza. The foreign minister said Turkey's ambassador to the Netherlands, accompanied by a group of Turkish legislators, submitted a declaration of intervention to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. With the development, Turkey, one of the fiercest critics of Israel's actions in Gaza, becomes the latest nation seeking to participate in the case. Spain, Mexico, Colombia, Nicaragua, and Libya have also joined the case, as have Palestinian officials. Notice all of these nations that have joined this lawsuit. Now Turkey has jumped on board. The article says in May, Turkey suspended trade with Israel, citing its assault on Gaza. In contrast to the Western nations that have designated Hamas a terrorist organization, Erdogan has recommended the group, or commended the group, I should say, calling it a liberation movement, which is laughable. Here's Erdogan calling Hamas a liberation movement instead of what it actually is, a terrorist organization whose goal is to eradicate the Jewish people in the nation of Israel. And notice also what the article brought up here. Back in May, Turkey suspended trade with Israel. Now, every single economics class and political science class I ever had in college, the professors always said a trade war is a prerequisite to a physical war. And so here is Turkey involved in essentially a trade war with Israel, suspending trade with Israel. And beyond that, they're jumping on board with this phony sort of ICJ genocidal lawsuit. So my point in all of this is Turkey is fitting into the identical prophetic orbit that Ezekiel predicted 2,600 years ago. Here's how the article concludes. It says, since Erdogan took power in 2003, former allies, Turkey and Israel, have experienced a volatile relationship marked by periods of severe friction and reconciliation. The war in Gaza has disrupted the most recent attempts at normalizing ties. So in other words, the antagonism between the Israelis and the Turks, or the Turks against Israelis, is something that goes back to 2003. That situation is constantly getting worse. And whatever reconciliation the two nations have enjoyed since Erdogan came to power is continuing to disintegrate. Let's talk just for a moment about Afghanistan. Notice our map again here. And we have the various nations of Central Asia circled. One of the invaders against the land of Israel in the last days will not just be Iran. It will not just be Turkey, but it will be an entity called Magog. We believe that the entities called Magog in Ezekiel's prophecies, Ezekiel 38 and 39, essentially represents the stands: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and something that has been in the news over the last 3 years, Afghanistan also will be involved in this invasion. Now you might be asking yourself, why in the world do we believe that these stands represent Magog? Notice Japheth's sons, going back to the book of Genesis chapter 10 and verse 2. Japheth had various sons. He had 7 sons, and one of those sons was named Magog. This becomes, what I'm showing you here, the basis of how we know the various entities spoken of in Ezekiel 38 and 39 represent modern day countries. Josephus, you'll notice this quote here in his Antiquities, a first century classical Jewish historian. He identified Magog as a group of people called the Scythians. Now, sometimes this is pronounced the Scythians, sometimes it's pronounced the Scythians, but whatever pronunciation you want to use, you'll notice what Josephus said. Magog founded those that from him were named the Magogites, who are by the Greeks called the Scythians. Now, any encyclopedia will tell you that the Scythians migrated from Central Asia to southern Russia about the 8th to the 7th century BC. So therefore, when Ezekiel had this prophecy about Magog, and Josephus tells us that Magog is the Scythians, we think that the people that are known as the Magogites or the Scythians would represent the various nations of Central Asia. Notice this chart here. It talks about ancient names from Ezekiel 38, verses 1 through 9. And number 1 on the list there, you can see it underlined, is Magog, who we believe represents Central Asia. Now, why is Afghanistan as part of this group so significant? Well, you'll remember about 3 years ago at this time, the debacle that was pulled off by the Biden administration flooded our headlines. And what did this particular debacle involve? It involved our presence, the United States, in Afghanistan. And the Biden administration decided to pull out the military first the weapons second, and the innocent civilians, allies of ours, American citizens third. Why they insisted on that order is anybody's guess, but that's what they decided to do. And as a result, it didn't work out. It was a complete and total failure. It's probably one of the darkest days in American history ever since the toppling of our embassy in Iran back in 1979. And all of that weaponry, because of this mismanagement, fell under the auspices and the jurisdiction of the Taliban. Here is a chart taken from Fox News. It's entitled U.S. Weapons Seized by the Taliban as a result of this Afghanistan debacle. Notice all of the weaponry that was lost. 85 billion was lost to the Taliban related to U.S. funding to the Afghan army. 75,000 vehicles were lost to the Taliban. 600,000 weapons were lost. 200 aircraft were lost. And at the time, you remember 3 years ago, here on Pastor's Point of View, we reported on this, and we showed you this picture here. These are the members of the Taliban sort of crowded behind a desk after the American Afghanistan pullout. This is the power that they gained, the weaponry that they gained. And at that time when we reported this, we showed you this particular slide from, I think it was then Twitter. It's actually Chuck Schumer sort of dancing in a video with other Democrats at a party in the wake of all of this. It's kind of a picture of Nero, fiddling while Rome is burning, showing you the incompetence of our leadership, our American leadership at that time, and quite frankly, extending right into the present. And this is what it said there in that particular tweet dated August 21st, 2021, I believe it is. It says 10,000 American civilians trapped behind an army of barbarians in a foreign land. And this is how much they care, showing our Senate leadership, Chuck Schumer, Democrat, sort of acting like he could care less, dancing, partying, etc. And so essentially what happened is the United States of America, because of this debacle, armed Afghanistan. Now, why bring all of this up? We think this is prophetically significant because it contributes to the Ezekiel 38 and 39 scenario, because now those nations of Central Asia, Afghanistan being one of them, are now loaded with American arms and armament to make their invasion of Israel that Ezekiel predicts all the more easy. I believe that is the prophetic significance of our Afghanistan pullout. And we reported on all of this about 3 years ago. Well, lo and behold, here is the 3-year anniversary. It's in the news again. August the 15th, an article from the Western Journal. And it says, Taliban uses American equipment to mock the United States on the anniversary of Biden's Afghanistan debacle. Notice what this article says. It says, but now the Taliban is literally parading around with American weapons left behind because a Democrat gave the cut and run order. How's that for humiliating? According to Fox News, the terrorist organization marked the 3rd anniversary of President Biden's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan by hosting a parade at a former American base featuring cast-off American military goods. They were uniformed soldiers carrying guns, military vehicles such as tanks and pickup trucks, and even a motorcycle group carrying the Taliban flag through Bagram Airfield on Wednesday to celebrate the gift Biden handed them by pulling forces out ahead of the August 31st, 2021 deadline. All of this happened under Biden's direct orders with the consent of Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, let me interject something. Remember, Kamala Harris said she was the last person in the room when this decision was made. So she can't, now that she's running for president, wash her hands of this. She was intimately involved in this debacle. Now Democrats are trying to convince the American people to keep them in power. They want us to believe that the former President Donald Trump is the dangerous one and Harris the safe and sane choice, all while our enemies parade evidence of the Biden-Harris's administration failures in front of us. The world was a safer place with Trump in the White House, the article says, mean tweets and all. We need a strong, competent leader for these dangerous times. America and its standing in the world simply won't survive another 4 years with the Democrats in power. And we can talk about the politics of this all day long, but I'm here to bring you the prophetic significance of this. The Biden administration armed one of the principal powers that will invade Israel in the last days, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Magog. And now here we are 3 years later, where they are there in Afghanistan, sort of rubbing it in our faces. Look at all of the weaponry that we have received as a free gift. Thank you, the Biden administration. It's just another piece in the puzzle on the growing alignment that Ezekiel predicted in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Let's talk just for a little bit about Russia. You'll notice our map here where we have Rosh or Russia circled. We know that Russia is most likely going to spearhead this invasion, accompanied by Turkey, Iran, the nations of Central Asia, also the Sudan, which I'll mention in just a moment. And constantly in the headlines, we see Russia's developing antagonism towards Israel as well. Notice this particular headline from presstv.ir, August 13th, 2024. It says, Putin of Russia, obviously, tells Abbas Russia is doing everything to support Palestine. And notice what this article says. Putin received Abbas in the Kremlin on Tuesday, where the two leaders exchanged views on the situation in the Middle East in light of the current aggravation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip, the Kremlin said in a post on the Telegram messaging app. Putin told the Palestinian leader, now keep in mind who we're dealing with. We're dealing with Abbas, the leader of the so-called Palestinians, the one who wants to create a Palestinian state, which we believe is will ultimately be a terrorist zone within the nation of Israel. This gentleman, and I use the phrase gentleman obviously very loosely because he is a committed terrorist, Holocaust denier, etc. There he is meeting with Putin of Russia in the Kremlin, and Putin takes the opportunity to tell Abbas how supportive Russia is towards this terrorist zone, Palestinian state within the borders of Israel. So it's linking Russia's antagonism and ultimate goal of destroying the nation of Israel. The article says Putin told the Palestinian leader that Moscow is doing everything to support Palestine and the Palestinian people. The only way to create a long-lasting, reliable, stable peace in the region, Putin said, is the implementation of all UN resolutions and the creation of a fully fledged Palestinian state. Abbas, for his part, praised Moscow's efforts to achieve Palestinian recognition and called Russia one of the dearest friends of the Palestinian people. The Russian leader has always been a staunch supporter of the Palestinian people and the establishment of a Palestinian state. Now, we've talked at length in prior updates about the myth of the Palestinian people, the myth of a Palestinian state, how it's nothing more than dialogue to put into place a terrorist zone within the land of Israel to make the job of eradicating Israel all the more easy in the future. And here's Russia with Putin as its leader, indicating that Russia is completely on board with this Palestinian agenda. So my point is, all of these nations, whether you're talking about Iran, whether you're talking about Turkey, whether you're talking about Russia, are now in the identical prophetic orbit that Ezekiel, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, identified 2,600 years ago. And what's interesting about these various nations is not only are they postured against Israel, but they're cooperating with each other. It's hard to keep up with the news cycle. There is so much cooperation between these entities. So as an example of that, notice this map we have here where we have Russia, one of the invaders, Ezekiel 38 and 39, and Turkey circled. That means that these two powers would not only be hostile to Israel in the last days, I think we're demonstrating that is happening, but the two are going to start cooperating with each other. So to showcase this cooperation, notice this article, August 9th, 2024, from english.enabaldi.net, and the title of this is Turkey Welcomes Russia's Establishment of a Military Base Within Turkey. Notice what the article says. It says on Saturday, August 2nd, 2024, Russia announced the establishment of a new military base in Ain al-Arab region, obviously located in Turkey. The article goes on and it says Russia's first military presence there began in October 2019 during the Peace Spring operation carried out by the Turkish army and the Syrian National Army against the Syrian Democratic Forces east of the Euphrates. So these two powers, Turkey and Russia, are cooperating with each other to the point where Russia is setting up military bases within Turkey. That's exactly what Ezekiel said would manifest itself in the last days. And it shows us how close we are to the eventual fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecies. Notice also this particular map, and we've got Russia and we've got the Sudan circled. Now, we believe that the Sudan, modern-day Sudan, represents Cush, or Ethiopia in Ezekiel's predictions. The Hebrew in Ezekiel 38 and 39 just says Cush, but many modern translations, for example, the New American Standard Bible, will just substitute the word Ethiopia over the word Cush. So why do we believe that Cush represents the modern-day Sudan? Notice this particular quote here from Josephus, our first century historian, who tells us where these different groups settled, and we can identify the modern nations containing these groups. That's how we're able to piece together this Gog-Magog, Ezekiel 38 and 39 scenario prediction. Josephus identifies Cush with the Ethiopians. He says, "For of the four sons of Ham, time has not all heard the name of Cush. For the Ethiopians over whom he reigned are even at this day, both by themselves and by all men in Asia, called the Cushites." Now, let me borrow a quote here from the Wycliffe Bible Encyclopedia, where it identifies Cush as the Sudan. It says this: the designation Ethiopia is misleading, for it did not refer to the modern state of Ethiopia. Cush bordered Egypt on the south, or the modern-day Sudan. So when Josephus says Cush is Ethiopia, and you understand where the ancient country of Ethiopia, the land area that they presided over, it's a very safe conclusion that Cush equals what today we would call the Sudan. And so if Russia and the Sudan are going to invade Israel in the last days, if we're correct on all of this in terms of an interpretation, then it stands to reason that Russia and the Sudan would start to cooperate with each other on the eve of this invasion. And to prove that such cooperation is in effect, notice this particular article from the Medium.com. The title of it, August the 5th, 2024, it says, Russian troops enter Sudan, escalating regional tensions. A couple of lines from the article, it says, Russian forces have repeatedly entered the Sudan with the support of the country's military. The article goes on and it says, the entry of Russian forces into Sudan marks a notable shift in the region's geopolitical landscape. The article concludes as follows: Russia's increased involvement in Africa, including its military and economic partnerships, plural, reflects a broad strategy to expand its influence on the continent. See, a lot of people have criticized this Gog-Magog invasion that we're speaking of because of the role that the North African nations like the Sudan are going to play. And people say, well, this invasion is just not credible. There's no Russian involvement in North Africa. Well, this article is saying Russia is involved and is very influential in North Africa and now has a presence in the Sudan. This is exactly what you would anticipate to happen if Russia and the Sudan, as Ezekiel indicates, are going to invade the nation of Israel in the last days. So that is a lot of data and a lot of information showing you that the Gog-Magog alignment is crystallizing. It's becoming crystal clear. Every time I go back and study this, the scenario doesn't get more and more murky. The scenario gets more and more precise. Israel is in place. The right nations that are supposed to come against Israel are in place. And they're all cooperating with one another. So I bring a lot of that to your attention in these various prophecy updates that we do. Let's, for the sake of time, go on to our second major category or bullet point here, and it has to do with the world against Israel. The Bible predicts that the entire world is going to turn against Israel and Jerusalem. Notice what Zechariah predicted 2,500 years ago. Zechariah says, it will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for the nations. All who lift it will be severely injured. And all, notice the reference there to all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. And then a chapter or two later in Zechariah 14 verse 2, we see this similar prediction by Zechariah. Zechariah says, for I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. The city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravished. Half of the city will be exiled, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. So when Ezekiel keeps talking about all the nations coming against Israel, that is a fascinating prophecy because, first of all, you have to have an Israel in place for that to happen. Check. We've had that since 1948, Israel's War of Independence. And you'll notice that worldwide sympathy for Israel, which she rightfully received after the Holocaust, is disintegrating as nation after nation is turning against Israel. In fact, here is an interesting map. This is put out by the Palestine Project. The title of it is Countries That Recognize Palestine. These are all of the countries of the world that believe in this idea of a Palestinian state, which we believe will be nothing more than a terrorist zone within Israel's borders. These are all of the nations of the earth demanding that. And you'll notice the date of this. This is May 22nd, 2024, a few months before the events of October the 7th. Actually, I may have my dates wrong on that. October the 7th occurred earlier. October the 7th, 2023. This is May the 22nd, 2024. And my point is the events of October the 7th have accelerated this process, as you can see from this map, of all of the countries demanding a Palestinian state within the land of Israel and within the borders of Israel. And what is happening is the world is turning against Israel, exactly like Zechariah said would happen at the end of the age. All of these countries demanding a Palestinian state, what are they talking about exactly? Well, you'll notice this map here that we frequently use. What they want to do is take that kind of lighter blue area called the West Bank, and they want to turn that over to Palestinian control. And they believe that if they do this, which as you can see from this map, will reduce Israel's width by less than 10 miles, they believe peace is going to break out in the region. Here's a second map that we like to use describing this Palestinian state. It's the area that's called Samaria and Judea. And if you want to see how crazy this idea is that giving that area to the Palestinians will bring peace, look at that darker brown area called Gaza in the southwestern portion of the map. That's an area that the Israelis turned over to the Gazans in 2004. They had one and only one election in 2005. They brought the Gazans, Hamas, into power. And that's the part of within the borders of Israel, really, that have been used for one terrorist attack after another into Israel. Projectiles fired constantly at the Israelis from Gaza, tunnels of terror constructed from Gaza into the land of Israel, the beautiful scenic ocean area, the hotels, the botanical gardens have all been destroyed, and they literally turned that into a terrorist zone. And that's what caused the events of October the 7th. Had the Israelis not turned Gaza over to the inhabitants of Gaza back in 2004, the events of October the 7th of last year, 2023, would have never transpired. Well, what the world community thinks is, well, let's turn a bigger area over. Samaria and Judea over to the Palestinians. That will surely bring peace. Well, if the two-state solution didn't work so well with Gaza, why would you think ever in anyone's right mind that it would work for that larger area called Samaria and Judea, sometimes called the West Bank? And yet, since the events of October the 7th, nation after nation after nation after nation has been demanding this Palestinian state, sometimes called a two-state solution. And this becomes evidence that we're living in the general season where Zechariah's prophecies will be fulfilled, because the world is turning against Israel in general and Jerusalem in particular, exactly like Zechariah anticipated and predicted. Now let me add another sort of layer to this. The New World Order it's a three-legged stool. It has three parts. And if you take away one of these parts, you can't have a New World Order. You have to have an economic angle, you have to have a political angle, and you have to have a spiritual angle. All three have to be working in tandem to bring in something called the New World Order, global governance. the New World Order wants this divided Israel concept that I have been speaking of, and they have been heavily at work in the economic realm, the political realm, as I've shown you, to bring in this so-called two-state solution. I want to show you a couple quotes, though, where they have been very aggressively in the spiritual world, putting sort of a spiritual veneer. Might I even call it a Christian veneer? And of course, I use the word Christian very loosely there because I don't think what they're doing is biblical, but a Christendom, Christian veneer on this idea of a two-state solution. They want the world to believe that if you do not believe in this two-state solution and support this two-state solution, then some way, somehow, you're not Christian, you're not spiritual, etc. What I've been trying to describe here is related to the spiritual component of the New World Order, which we know is coming. Notice the book of Revelation, chapter 17 and verse 15. It says, "And he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues." The harlot here is a description of the false religion that will cover the entire earth, peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues in the last days. It's describing a new world order that's not just economic, it's not just political, but it's spiritual. It has the air of spirituality. And if the New World Order wants this two-state solution, it stands to reason that they would start to summon various religious leaders to sort of wrap the two-state solution up in spiritual verbiage and language. With all of that being said, that's why I found this particular article from the Jerusalem Post very interesting. August the 2nd, 2024. Archbishop of Canterbury, a religious figure, urges the nations to respect the ICJ opinion on Israeli occupation. The article goes on and it says, Justin Welby, who also heads the Worldwide Anglican Communion, said in a statement that the ICJ opinion has made it clear that the occupation is unlawful and must end. And what they're speaking of here is a globalist court like the ICC. The ICJ has now come out with this ruling. Now, as we've explained in prior updates, this is not an actual legal ruling, in my opinion. This is a political ruling because there's nothing that the nation of Israel is currently doing that's illegal. But the world, to promote this two-state solution, wants people to believe that the Israelis are currently illegally occupying Palestinian land. They're currently illegally occupying the so-called West Bank. They're currently illegally occupying Samaria and Judea, and the Israelis need to give that up. They need to give it back to the Palestinians, or maybe saying giving it back to the Palestinians is not the right verbiage. Give it to the Palestinians. Then the world is going to have its two-state solution, and if you don't agree with this, then you're just not spiritual, according to the Archbishop of Canterbury. I mean, what does the Archbishop of Canterbury really know about international law? I would say next to nothing. But his voice is sort of summoned to give this two-state solution, which I think will end. They want it to end in what I would call the final solution. They want this two-state solution, which is a pretext for the final solution, to be given sort of this air of spiritual legitimacy. This ICJ ruling goes against the writings of Jacques Gautier, who in a 20-year doctoral dissertation at the University of Geneva demonstrated as an international Canadian lawyer that the Israelis aren't doing anything illegal. Goes against the writings of Joan Peters in her book Time Immemorial, which demonstrates the Israelis today are not doing anything illegal. It goes against the San Remo Accords, the post-World War I allies, and their legitimate giving to Israel the land that she's on. It goes against the 1947 United Nations resolution, the post-World War II powers giving to the Israelis the land that she is rightfully on. Well, here comes the ICJ saying that now Israel is doing something illegal. And to get the world to believe this, here comes the Archbishop of Canterbury saying, yeah, it's the spiritual thing is to support the ICJ ruling. This is the religious arm of the New World Order doing its thing. Well, anyway, here's what the article says. The Church of England's spiritual head urged governments on Friday to respect the findings of the United Nations top court that Israel's occupation of the West Bank is illegal, saying the law should not be upheld in a selective manner. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, known as the World Court, said in an advisory opinion last month the occupation should be withdrawn as soon as possible. Justin Welby, who also heads the worldwide Anglican Communion, see all these religious figures involved in this, said in a statement that the ICJ opinion has made it clear that the occupation is unlawful and must end. Welby said it is clear to him from many visits in recent decades the system of military rule imposed by successive Israeli governments in occupied territories was one of systemic discrimination. Now, these are some of the great myths of the Middle East. Number one, that the Israelis are doing anything illegal. They're not. Joan Peters, Jacques Goudier, San Remo, then the United Nations in 1947, you put all of that material together, you'll see very clearly that you can say whatever you want about Israel, but you can't say that they're doing anything illegal. Well, here comes the international, what is this called? The International Court of Justice arguing that the Israelis are doing something illegal. Well, that is not an actual legal ruling. They did not make that ruling based on actual law, but based on their political opinion that we want a two-state solution. So that's one of the great myths of the Middle East, that Israel is occupying something. You can't occupy what you own. And then another great myth of the Middle East is what Welby says here, that the Israelis are involved in systemic discrimination. That isn't true either. You can be an Arab and become an Israeli citizen and live within Israel and enjoy a free life, a successful life, a prosperous life, as long as you commit on the front end not to come into the land of Israel to work to destroy the nation of Israel. The Israelis have what we would call non-citizens, or maybe a better word is Arabs, in the Knesset, on the Supreme Court. So if Israel is somehow involved in systemic discrimination, as Mr. Welby here indicates, Israel's doing a lousy job of it. But the propaganda is so thick and intense, people think Israel is doing something discriminatory, which she is not. They think that she is doing something illegal, which she is not. And so to get the rest of the world to agree with the New World Order's agenda of a so-called two-state solution, they have to put this spiritual syrup on it. And that's the significance of the Archbishop of Canterbury's recent remarks. All he is doing is putting a spiritual or so-called Christian veneer over something that will ultimately be destructive to the Israelis, this so-called two-state solution. Now, notice also the Pope. got involved with this. Notice this from X. The title of this is BRICS News. This is something the Pope said recently. It says, Pope Francis says Israel's war in Gaza is terrorism. Here's the direct quote from the Pope in a recent speech he gave. He says, quote, I continue to receive very serious and painful news from Gaza. Unarmed civilians are subjected to bombings and shootings. A mother and her daughter were killed by Israeli snipers while going to the restroom. It is terrorism. Now again, I believe that is largely false. I believe he is relying on a sort of Hamas interpretation of what's happening there. What the Israelis are doing is they're rooting out terrorism within Gaza, rooting out Hamas within Gaza, so another catastrophic October 7th will not happen. But the New World Order is trying to make it sound like the Israelis are involved in some sort of terrorist activity. It's not terrorist activity, it's self-defense. And here comes the Pope putting a spiritual veneer on the Hamas interpretation of those recent political events. So it's very interesting to me how all of these sort of religious figures, whether it's the Pope, whether it's the Archbishop of Canterbury, are now lining up with this two-state solution mentality, and that's how the New World Order works. When the Pope speaks on these things, it's designed for the gullible. It's designed for the easily deceived. It's designed to get people to think that somehow a two-state solution is spiritual and Christian. It's designed to get people to think that Israel's reaction against terrorism within Gaza is somehow non-Christian. And it becomes a very, very powerful force coupled with these events to spiritually, in a spiritual sense, turn the nations of the earth against Israel in the last days, which is exactly what Zechariah predicted would happen 2,500 years ago. Let me, if I could, squeeze in one more category in this particular prophecy update. Let's go to the temple, our final bullet point in this session. We know from Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, we've read the verse many, many times, that the Antichrist, midway through the tribulation period, will desecrate the rebuilt Jewish temple. Notice what this verse says. It says, and he, that's Antichrist, will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, a 7-year period, in other words. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. We have this portrayed graphically as an overview. It marks out the coming 7-year tribulation period. It tells you what will start it, what will stop it, and what, according to Daniel 9:27, in the middle of the week, in the middle of that 7-year time period will happen, which is the desecration of the Jewish temple. The Antichrist, who will have started this time period by entering into a covenant with Israel, will then betray the Jewish people. He will set himself up in the temple as God. He will put an end to Jewish sacrifice and offering functioning at that time in the temple. He will set up an image, Revelation 13, verse 15, in that temple. And all of these are prophecies that can't happen unless you have a functioning Jewish temple. And what we're dealing with here is temple number 3. Notice this brief overview of Israel's 4 temples. Israel's first temple was built by Solomon and destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Israel's second temple was built by the returnees from the Babylonian captivity and ultimately destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. And ever since that point in time, Israel has had no temple. But prophecy demands that she must have temple 3 in place during the tribulation period for the Antichrist to desecrate. So if we are on the eve of the 7-year tribulation period, and we largely believe we are, we should see more and more rumblings within Israel concerning the construction or the ambition to build temple number 3. Some Bible prophecy teachers put it this way: when the discussion of the world moves to Israel, you're on God's hour hand in terms of his end time stopwatch. When the discussion of the world moves to Jerusalem and gets more specific, now we're dealing with the minute hand. When the discussion of the world gets more specific and now moves to the Temple Mount, now you're dealing with the second hand. And so with all of that being said, this particular article here, August 18th, 2024, you'll notice all these articles that I'm quoting from are very recent, happening this month. This one from the JewishNewsService.org, jns.org, is very interesting. Here's the title of it. It says, "There is no status quo on the Temple Mount." What is this article about? It says this: nearly 3,000 Jews visited the Temple Mount last week on Tuesday, Tish B'Av, which commemorates the destruction of the ancient Jewish temples. But it was the visit to the Temple Mount by National Security Minister Ben-Gvir and Minister of the Negev and the Galilee, Wazerloff, if I'm pronouncing that right, that set off another firestorm of controversy. Jews have been praying publicly and regularly on the Temple Mount for the last decade, he said. The only difference, he told JNS, was that until now no one acknowledged it or said anything about it. What made Ben-Gvir's visit different was his official announcement that prayer on the Temple Mount is permitted, he added. For decades, the Jews have been praying publicly on the Temple Mount every day with the permission of the police, said Glick. I believe that's Carolyn Glick that's being quoted here. The central understanding today regarding the site involves the terms agreed upon by Israel and the Islamic Waqf when Israel conquered the Old City in Jerusalem and the Temple Mount during the 1967 Six-Day War. This became known as the status quo. While officially Israel denies changes have been made to the status quo, it no longer exists as formulated by then Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan in 1967. You remember him, the Israeli with the eye patch, who post 1967, the Israelis getting control over the Temple Mount, said, no, we're going to return that to this group called the WAF, W-A-Q-F. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. And the Temple Mount is now going to be administered by Jordan. They're going to make the rules, and we're going to adhere to their status quo. Well, one of the rules post-1967 was no public prayers on the Temple Mount. Ben-Gvir of Israel is now aggressively challenging that. Continuing with the article, according to Glick, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is paying lip service to it, but is totally supportive of changes that are happening. According to a statement issued by the Prime Minister's office on Tuesday in the wake of Ben-Gvir's visit and statement, it is the government and the Prime Minister who determine policy on the Temple Mount. There is no private policy of any minister, not the national security minister or any other minister on the Temple Mount. This morning's incident on the Temple Mount deviated from the status quo. Ben-Gvir's office pushed back, stating that as national security minister, he could set policy on the Mount and determine that the Jews could pray there. The policy of the National Security Minister is to allow freedom of worship for Jews anywhere, including the Temple Mount, and Jews will continue to do so in the future, read the statement. The Temple Mount is a sovereign area in the capital of the state of Israel. It continued. You see, what's happening here is a change in Israeli psychology. The rule used to be Jordan is going to set the rules over what goes on in the Temple Mount. One of the rules post 1967 is no public prayer. Now you see people like Ben-Gvir saying, not only are we going to pray publicly, but we're not going to ask Jordan's permission. So what you see within Israeli leadership at the highest levels is an aggressive mentality that says we're going to control what happens on the Temple Mount, which I believe is a pretext for them ultimately building Temple number 3, which prophecy demands must be functioning midway through the tribulation period. The article continues, and it says, after the 1967 war, the government handed down day-to-day control of the area to the Muslim Waqf religious authorities overseen by the Jordanian government, with Israel in charge of security. Jews were allowed to visit the Temple Mount in small numbers, but were forbidden from praying. Those are the old Jordanian post-Moshe Dayan 1967 rules that Ben-Gvir is now challenging. The article goes on and it says Ben-Gvir aims to change this. Unlike many others who fear backlash from Muslim countries, Ben-Gvir, his followers, and many other Israeli Jews believe the time has come to stand up to foreign abuse and to assert full sovereignty over the Temple Mount. But Muslim countries are against allowing Jews to pray on their holiest site, and unfortunately the United States agrees. The Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, on Tuesday issued a statement in which he criticized Ben-Gvir's visit to the Temple Mount. Washington strongly opposes Ben-Gvir's visit to the Temple Mount, which demonstrated blatant disregard for the historic status quo with respect to the holy sites in Jerusalem, Blinken said. These provocative actions only exacerbate tensions at a pivotal moment when all focus should be on the ongoing diplomatic efforts to achieve ceasefire agreement and secure the release of all hostages and create the conditions for broader regional stability, he added. The United States reaffirms our commitment to the preservation of the historic status quo and will continue to oppose unilateral steps that are counterproductive to achieving peace and stability and undermine Israel's security. So here goes Ben-Gvir challenging the status quo about praying on the Temple Mount, and here come the nations of the earth condemning Ben-Gvir, including the United States of America. I hope what you're seeing is at least two strands of prophetic thought coming into existence almost simultaneously. This event does nothing more than increase the hostility of the nations, particularly the Islamic nations, against Israel, and the hostility of even the United States against Israel, because this is going to upset something the United States wants, this two-state solution. So the nations coming against Israel, that's in play. But the prospect of the Israelis exerting more sovereignty over the Temple Mount, leading to Temple number 3, another prophetic strand of thought, is in play as well. The article says the idea that freedom of worship applies everywhere except for the Jews on the Temple Mount is viewed by many as preposterous and hypocritical, perhaps even anti-Semitic. In recent years, there have been accusations among Palestinians across the Muslim world of a conspiracy by Israel to Judaize Jerusalem, particularly the Temple Mount. Netanyahu has argued against this absurdity, Speaking before the United Nations General Assembly in 2011, Netanyahu said, "I often hear them accuse Israel of Judaizing Jerusalem. That's like accusing America of Americanizing Washington, or the British of Anglicizing London." Do you know why we're called Jews? Netanyahu asks. Because we come from Judea. And what they're saying is, of course, we should make the Temple Mount Jewish. It's our land. And I understand that Moshe Dayan gave that territory up and let Jordan manage it since 1967. But a lot of us Israelis, the Jews are now saying, are not going to follow Jordan's instructions. And we're going to pray on the Temple Mount whether Jordan likes it or not. That's a switch in Israeli psychology happening right now in our headlines, which is pushing us in the direction of Temple number 3. One of the central figures involved in normalizing Jewish visits to the Temple Mount is longtime activist El Boim. The Marabitun are an Islamic political movement of Muslim women founded by the northern branch of the Islamic movement in Israel. For years, these groups of women would follow Jewish visitors around the Temple Mount, screaming at them and harassing them with shouts, Allah Akbar, meaning God is great. Israel finally outlawed these groups, forbidding them to harass Jewish visitors. Since then, Jews have been able to peacefully visit the Temple Mount without fear. El Boim told JNS he believes that the more the Jews ascend to the Temple Mount, the greater and the faster rate of development will be. In other words, we already broke Jordan's rules by getting rid of these protesters who used to harass us as Jews when we were visiting the Temple Mount. And now we're getting ready to get rid of another Jordanian rule. We're gonna pray on the Temple Mount because it belongs to us, whether Jordan likes it or not. Tom Nisani, CEO of an NGO, an Israeli nonprofit organization dedicated to raising awareness about the Temple Mount and its heritage in Jewish communities worldwide, told JNS it's exciting to see Jews praying, singing, and bowing down on Tisha B'Av on the Temple Mount according to the law. Now listen to this. Nasani also noted that more Jews have been visiting the Temple Mount in recent years. In 2021, just 15,000 visited, while this year, mid-August alone, 32,237 Jews had already ascended to the Temple Mount. I'm reading a lot here. I'm just going to read a quick conclusion, but the reason I'm reading so much from this article is it's a very lengthy article. When you get it and download it and read it, you'll see that. Here's how the article concludes. The Hebrew calendar, he added, over 40,000 Jews had visited the site who strengthened Jewish sovereignty on the Temple Mount with an overwhelming Jewish presence. This is our direction, and we will continue to act until we achieve our full rights on the Temple Mount, he said. End of article. In other words, the Temple Mount is ours. It belongs to us. Don't accuse us of Judaizing Jerusalem any more than anyone would accuse someone of Americanizing Washington, D.C. We realize Jordan had some rules, but they've been changed before to keep people harassing us off the Temple Mount. And we're going to keep pushing the envelope, and now we're going to publicly pray on the Temple Mount. So what you're seeing is a developing psychology where Israel is asserting greater and greater jurisdiction over the Temple Mount. And my point is that is the identical psychology that is now in place that I think will very quickly move to the actual building of Temple number 3. And as that happens, you can see how close we are to the 7-year tribulation period, because the 7-year tribulation period prophecies, Daniel 9:27, indicate that that temple must be functioning midway through the tribulation period. What have we covered in this prophecy update? The Gog-Magog coalition, the world coming against Israel to the point where a spiritual veneer is now being put over the so-called two-state solution. And we've also covered aggressive movement into the prophetically significant temple number 3. Given the fact that we went just a tad over today, we're not going to do any infomercials by way of conclusion other than this one. I want to remind you of the 2025 prophecy conference that is going to be hosted here at Sugarland Bible Church, Saturday, February 22nd, 2025. Believe it or not, folks, registration is already filling up, so register immediately and secure your position. There's a banquet on Friday night, an all-day conference here at Sugarland Bible Church on Saturday. The banquet is going to be held at nearby Sugar Creek Country Club. We invite you to stick around for our Sunday morning services here at Sugarland Bible Church on the 23rd, because our speakers are going to be presenting during our normal teaching times and worship sessions here at Sugarland Bible Church. The speakers will be Bill Federer, Olivier Melnick, Dr. Randall Price, and myself, Dr. Andy Woods. The title of this conference is Faith for Final Days. We're going to be getting into worldview issues, Bible prophecy. Who knows what our world is going to be like by the time we hit February 21st, 22nd, and 23rd of 2025. Of course, all of our personal hopes is that the rapture will take place before then, and thereby making the conference unnecessary. However, if the rapture doesn't occur, we're going to need a prophetic analysis and a worldview analysis of everything that will be happening in our world. So we brought in the best of the best speakers to help us with that, to sort of steel, S-T-E-E-L, or fortify your mind as you take your stand in these last days, wherever the Lord has you. It's a great opportunity to get away from your normal routine. Come here to Sugarland. Go to the Sugarland Bible Church website to register and to get full details on this, to just receive those spiritual vitamins that you need for taking the stand that God has you to take in these last days. We're going to have special music by Olam Music and Worship. Also, Rebecca and Claude Chu are going to be doing our music at the banquet, and so I want to make you aware of that conference coming up. I'll go over some of the other infomercials at the conclusion of our prophecy update for next week. And until then, Dr. Andy Woods signing off. Thank you for watching Pastor's Point of View, supporting Pastor's Point of View, sharing Pastor's Point of View, and most importantly, praying for Pastor's Point of View. We'll see you in our next broadcast together. God bless you.